80 years ago, the last great amphibious operation of World War II in Europe took place at Walcheren, at the entrance to the Scheldt estuary. Today, I'm going to describe the operation and the circumstances that led up to it. So let's step back to the 4th September 1944, when the 11th Armoured Division liberated the city of Antwerp and seized the port and dock facilities from a very surprised German garrison. Together with the Belgian resistance, the docks, vital for future operations, were saved from destruction. Antwerp was at that time the greatest port in Europe. It was capable of offloading 40,000 tons per day, but it was 45 miles from the mouth of the River Scheldt, which was guarded at its mouth by the fortified island of Walcheren. Furthermore, the land approaches adjacent to the river were in German hands. If this port was to be of any use to the Germans, would have to be removed. At this stage of the campaign, there was a fleeting opportunity to trap the withdrawing German 15th Army in Walcheren and South Beveland before the German ground forces could recover their balance, as they quickly did. Unfortunately, the arrival of 11th Armoured Division in Antwerp marked the culmination of the pursuit from the Seine, and the opportunity was lost. 11th Armoured Division had 1 day of fuel left. Bernstrecht was only 20 miles away, and General Roberts has admitted that he squandered the opportunity to bottle up the remnants of the 15th Army in South Beveland. Fatigue, failure in intelligence, lack of drive, or just bad luck conspired to seize failure from the jaws of success. But in its defence, by the time the 11th Armoured Division reached Antwerp, the supply lines were stretched to breaking point, and all logistic planning that had underpinned the Allied success to date was now being tested to the limit. I'm going to talk a bit about logistics because supply, maintenance, call it what you will, is a key factor in what followed and central to the Scheldt operation. Although this slide shows what happened post D-Day, it also happens to be what the SHAEF planners prepared for. Berlin was recognised as the ultimate goal of the campaign, but for logistic planning purposes, it was too far east. The interim objective was the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. Therefore, the logistic planners built their planned maintenance on a drive to the Ruhr. They did this by phase days, measuring all classes of supply required by the fighting elements, as well as the air forces. Port capacity, lines of communication, shipping availability were but a few of the factors to be considered. We know that the Mulberry harbours were vital to the maintenance of the armies on the continent. Until some smaller ports such as Dieppe and Ostend were secured, all supply came from the rear maintenance area in Normandy. Until Antwerp was available, Mulberry, small Norman ports and air freight were the only ways of supplying the army and the air force. Now, for the closet logisticians amongst you, here are a few facts and figures that show the vital importance of the artificial ports. But implicit in these figures is that everything that arrived on the continent had to be put in a vehicle or a trailer and driven forward. But maintenance 1944 looked entirely different to today. First of all, containers that we love so much didn't exist. Almost everything that arrived on the continent was break bulk. It was hugely manpower intensive and specialist in nature. Fuel was almost entirely packed. It came to the continent from England to Port-en-Bessin via Pluto, an undersea pipeline. Passing through a network of pipes to pipeheads, it was packed manually into jerrycans. By November 1944, 17 million jerrycans had arrived on the continent. At the end of the war, only 2.5 million were traceable. But it wasn't straightforward. The transport infrastructure had been destroyed in the prelude to D-Day. What hadn't been destroyed by the Allies, the Germans systematically destroyed, such as the port facilities in Le Havre and Cherbourg. All of this had to be repaired, and that material had to be included in the maintenance calculations. So what? As I said earlier, logistic planners had worked out a formula for the necessary level of supply to be available. Central in the planning assumptions was that the Germans would stand on the lines of the River Seine and Somme. No one foresaw the catastrophic collapse of the German army in Normandy, their defeat in detail at Falaise, and the withdrawal of the 15th Army towards Holland. The impact was serious. It was expected that the Allies would be at the Seine at D+90 with 12 US divisions. In fact, the reality was that there were 16 US divisions 150 miles beyond the Seine. It created a logistic challenge of epic proportions. There were 5 armies in the field, all vying for the limited supplies available. By the 1st of September, the Allies were across the Seine and racing north. On the coastal fringe, elements of the Canadian Army pushed north against the German 15th Army, the commander of which, General Gustav von Zangen's main effort, was now to save as much of his army as possible and delay the British-Canadian forces. At this stage in the campaign, logistic priorities, command relationships, and personalities all united to create a crisis for Eisenhower. Montgomery had been the commander of all ground forces in Normandy, and following the breakout, he was still de facto in this role. In late August, he raised the question of ground command with Eisenhower, pointing out that in his opinion, he should remain in the role, although he was aware that Eisenhower was about to issue direction on command relationships. In parallel, Montgomery was convinced that a narrow thrust with the weight of Allied supply behind him could bounce the Rhine, envelop the Ruhr, and seize Berlin. Firstly, the issue of command was resolved when on the 1st September, Eisenhower took command of all armies in the field. Eisenhower favoured a broad front strategy, but recognised the opportunity raised by Montgomery, and he approved his operation, directing the northern group of armies to seize the Ruhr. Eisenhower's agreement was a fudge, and he gave Montgomery priority in supply, not primacy. He let Montgomery develop Market Garden in an attempt to seize the Rhine Bridge. In doing so, he failed to impress on Montgomery the need for supply through Antwerp, although to a commander of Montgomery's stature it must have been plain to him. Market Garden went ahead. The focus in September was Market Garden, but more was happening. The Polish Armoured Division reached the Scheldt at Terneuzen, leaving the Germans with only Breskens to complete the withdrawal of the 15th Army. When that evacuation ended on the 23rd of September, 100,000 men, 6,000 vehicles, 6,000 horse-drawn wagons, and 750 pieces of artillery had crossed the Scheldt. On the 25th of September, Market Garden ended. And this slide illustrates the hardening of Eisenhower's position vis-à-vis Antwerp. At the same time, Montgomery fails to give clear instructions, effectively paying lip service to the Antwerp question. Montgomery continues to under-resource the Canadian Army, which had been tasked to conduct operations with a view to opening the Scheldt. Montgomery's main effort was focused north and east at the expense of the Canadians. But the damage had been done. The 15th German Army had escaped South Beveland, leaving 2 strong divisions in fortresses north and south of the Scheldt. Other formations had created a line north of Antwerp, including elements of the Parachute Army. The only way in which Antwerp could be used was to clear the Germans from the sea and land approaches in a series of deliberate operations. And it's for this reason that controversy rages on about Montgomery's handling of the situation, which resulted in a considerable number of casualties to the Canadians. Perhaps one of the most significant factors in the Scheldt battle occurred on the 27th September, when Major General Guy Simonds, commander of the 2nd Canadian Corps, took over command of the Canadian Army from General Crerar, who was sick and had returned to the UK. As 2 Corps commander, Simonds had been given the responsibility for planning the Scheldt operation. He brought his initial estimate with him as Army commander. Ramsay, on the right, had as early as the 23rd of August stressed the need for opening the Scheldt and preventing the destruction of the port installations. He made his support very clear now for the operation by making naval units available should they be requested. Simonds appreciated that an assault across the water couldn't be ruled out. Montgomery had help with airborne forces, and Simonds' outlined plan was to bomb the dikes protecting Walcheren and sink the island. Then everything that was left above the water would be systematically bombed to wear down the garrison. An airborne assault would then be followed by a waterborne assault. The dike in question was the West Capella Dike. It was the largest on the island and one of the oldest in Holland. It was composed of heavy compacted clay, 200 to 250 foot wide at mean high water level. It was estimated that to make a gap of 100 feet, 10,000 tons of clay would have to be moved. On the 29th September, a planning conference was held at 2nd Canadian Corps, at which it was decided to request that the dike be bombed. The RAF agreed to try if authority was given, in spite of the views of the engineers, who said it couldn't be done. On the 1st of October, Eisenhower approved the course of action. On the 2nd of October, leaflets were dropped warning residents, although many people were not aware of the approaching raid. And on the 3rd of October, Bomber Command attacked the dike with 243 bombers. The result was a 75-yard gap, which was to grow larger through tide and wave action and further bombing. Montgomery described it as an operation of truly magnificent accuracy, but there was considerable damage in the collateral and 125 civilians were killed. The island was flooded. Attempts to stem the flooding by the Germans were foiled by the opening of additional gaps at Vera and Nolla. The island was rendered virtually uninhabitable, and it created an intolerable psychological pressure on the garrison, who couldn't move. For soldiers that had been on the island for some years, the impact was greatest. A German was recorded as saying, "Without that terrible water, you'd never have beaten us." On the 2nd of October, General Simmons issued his operational directive for opening the Scheldt. The 3rd Canadian Division was released from Dunkirk. 1st British Corps was ordered to thrust north of Antwerp to protect the flank of 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division was ordered to close the eastern end of the South Beveland Peninsula. 2nd Canadian Corps was then to attack and destroy or capture all enemy remaining in Belgium and Holland. On conclusion of that operation, then develop operations with 2nd Canadian Division to clear South Beveland, and then capture Walcheren.